Good morning. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Subra Suresh, our distinguished alumnus and now president of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, USA, to talk to us this morning. I'm also delighted that we have such a huge turnout. We apologize. We should probably have made arrangements in SAC if we had anticipated such a large crowd, but it's always a nice problem to have. So I want to thank everyone for taking time to attend this lecture also. Professor Subra Suresh is the chief guest for our convocation tomorrow, and he will also be receiving an honoris causa at the convocation. And he will also be here for Alumni Day on Saturday. So I do invite everyone to participate in both those events as well. Subra is a 1977 BTech Mechanical from IIT Madras, and he received his Distinguished Alumnus Award in '97, just 20 years after he graduated from here. He was one of the earliest awardees of our Distinguished Alumnus Awards program. Of course, I'm sure many of you know that prior to his appointment as president of CMU, he was heading NSF, and he has played a tremendous role in shaping the policy and principles of NSF, and he may touch upon some of that in his talk today. He will also be giving two more talks. Tomorrow he's actually giving a lecture in the Mechanical Engineering Department, and on Saturday during Alumni Day we have invited him to also give a brief talk, and again, if you want to hear more from him, make sure that you participate in these seminars as well. Professor Suresh, just to quickly recap, got his BTech from IIT Madras in '77, MS from Iowa State University in '79, and SCD from MIT in 1981. He was with UC Berkeley as a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, and then he started his career as an assistant professor of engineering at Brown University. He had some visiting assignments at Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm and Sheffield University. He became a tenured professor at Brown in '93. He moved to the MIT in the same year to the Department of Material Science and Engineering, and he became Ford Professor of Engineering in 2002, and he has held positions of Program Chair, Advanced Materials Program, Singapore MIT Alliance, and Head Department of Material Science and Engineering. And he was appointed as Dean of Engineering at MIT in 2007 until 2010, when he took over as Director of NSF. He has obviously he has many distinctions, awards to his credit. I'm not going to go through those. His research interest has centered on quantitative investigations of microscopic and macroscopic aspects of mechanical behavior of metals, ceramics, thin films, piezoelectric materials, and composites. He has a large number of papers, patents, conference publications, 3 books, and his current focus is on biomaterials. I believe that's the topic he'll be touching upon in his presentation tomorrow in the Mechanical Engineering Department. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Suresh to deliver his talk.
Thank you, Professor Nagarajan, and I want to thank Director Bhaskar Ramamurthy for inviting me here. I don't have to say this, but it's always such a great pleasure to be back in IIT, especially IIT Madras, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to come here. This is my first trip as president of Carnegie Mellon University. There is no better place to visit than my alma mater. So thank you very much for inviting me back. I want to talk to you today about some of the thinking that went into a lot of activities at the National Science Foundation. I wanted to choose this topic for this particular audience for a variety of reasons. As you know, in the last 25 years or so, many countries, large and small, China and India being the large countries, if you really want to take a very small country, Qatar is a very good example. And Carnegie Mellon University has a campus in Qatar. avatar, um, over that entire spectrum of populations, historical evolution, different countries have placed science and engineering and the innovation that comes from science and engineering as a ticket to prosperity. If you read the Hindu newspaper yesterday morning on the front page, the poverty rate in India, even though there is still a lot of poverty, has been reduced by 15% in the last 8 years. Considering the size of India in terms of population, that's an enormous number of people who have moved out of poverty, even though there is still a lot more ways to go in that regard. Innovation from science and engineering is a key to that. So one of the things I hope to cover in the next 30 minutes or so is, why is it a new era? Why innovation? And how countries that have been very successful in this, in terms of the history of evolution, have addressed their leading role, and what are some of the ingredients that made them innovation leaders, especially a country like the US. So by no means all of what I'm going to tell you is going to come as a surprise to you. Most of you know this already. And by no means what I'm going to tell you is a complete story. It's only a very small part of a big picture. But nevertheless, it's a topic of a lot of current interest, not just for science and engineering, but also for societal changes. So that's where I'm coming from. Let me start with basic research as a ticket to innovation. And this is where most of the countries today, and I've had both at the NSF job and the previous job as Dean of Engineering at MIT, I've had the opportunities to talk to a lot of education ministers, finance ministers, science ministers, and prime ministers and heads of state. Oftentimes people confuse investments in research with return on investment. So if the government puts in so many crores of money into basic research, how much will he get back in 5 years? Oftentimes that kind of thinking runs counter to reality, and I want to give you some examples of why it may run into counterintuitive trends. So let's start with the history of this. How did the US start with basic research? Right after the Second World War, there was a professor of electrical engineering at MIT called Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was also one of the pioneers in building the first computer, which was about the size of this room. And he was the first dean of engineering at MIT. So I literally sat in the same chair that he did, even though I never had the privilege to meet him. He passed away in the 1970s. He was invited by the US government to come to Washington and to give advice to the president of the US on investments in science and engineering. His recommendations led to the creation of NASA. And he had a thesis which was very controversial in the 1940s, right after the Second World War. Dr. Vannevar Bush argued that innovation is very important for the economic prosperity of a country, and therefore it's very important for the military leadership of a country and for everything that the country is successful at. He further argued that innovation necessarily comes from basic research in science and engineering. And he further argued that basic research is best done at universities and colleges, where you have people who have the opportunity to think freely without worrying about economic consequences. Plus, they have the opportunity to educate and train young people who become future leaders in academia, industry, and government. And therefore, there is no better place to do basic research than the universities and colleges. And the last point of his thesis was the most controversial part. And he said it's not only the responsibility of the government, the federal government, to support basic research, it's the duty. It's an obligation of the federal government to use tax dollars to support basic research. So understandably, any good idea becomes very controversial, and his idea was controversial. When it first went to the White House, it got shot down, rejected, went back to him. And then it was accepted by President Harry Truman, who created the National Science Foundation in 1950. So Dr. Bush wrote a book called Science, the Endless Frontier, and that was the book that was responsible for the creation of the National Science Foundation as an agency in 1950. So that's the origin of basic research, and his views and his principles also led to the creation of the National Institutes of Health, what we now know as NASA, and many other organizations. Remarkably, he was never made the first director of the National Science Foundation because he was very controversial. He was never made president of MIT. He was on the board of MIT. But he founded a company which is now known as Raytheon Corporation. He was one of the two co-founders of the company. So he's a very, very influential figure in American science and American basic research. So with that background, what are the ingredients of research success and innovation? Let's take the US example. The US, this is a subjective statement, but by and large, most people would agree that the US, especially after the Second World War, has been the innovation leader in the world, whether you measure it in terms of number of Nobel Prizes. So since 1950, 35% of all the Nobel Prizes given in all the fields have been won by American scientists. Not all of them were born in the US. Only more than 1/3 of them were born abroad. Most of them got their first degrees abroad, but they received the Nobel Prize as American citizens. 35% of all the Nobel Prizes in the world. Or you take technologies that have changed the world. For example, GPS, internet, MRI, LASIK eye surgery, Google, Facebook, Apple, Yahoo, etc., which influence the day-to-day lives of billions of people all over the world. These ideas came from this ecosystem. So what is interesting about this ecosystem? So there were many new models for science funding that were created after the Second World War. The National Science Foundation was created to focus on basic research. So in 1950, the annual budget of NSF was $212,000 for the whole country. Last year, a few months ago, when I left NSF, I submitted a budget to US Congress, and that budget the request was $7.4 billion. And NSF's mandate is to fund all fields of science and engineering, including social, behavioral, and economic sciences. The only thing that NSF doesn't do is biomedical research or clinical research, which is the domain of the National Institutes of Health. Every other field of basic research is fair game, including in economics and social sciences. So this is the model. Plus you have other agencies like NIH, Department of Energy, Department of Defense Basic Research, DARPA, NASA, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, etc. The second major ecosystem development was the history. If you focus on times of great crises, the US focused on science and engineering, which is really remarkable. So let's go back to the year 1862. So the Civil War started in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was president. In 1862, already many, many millions of Americans were killing one another, and the country was torn apart. And in 1862, at the peak of the Civil War, the US started something called the Land Grant Act. It was passed by Congress. That created all the universities, what we know as state universities and public universities. Many of the public universities are land grant colleges. 2 private universities are also land grant colleges. Those 2 private universities are Cornell and MIT. Both are land grant colleges. And that completely changed the higher education system right at the peak of the Civil War. Then a year later in 1863, still during the Civil War, President Lincoln created the National Academy of Sciences. And just 2 months ago, the National Academy of Sciences celebrated its 150th anniversary. And who would have thought that right during a war, people would be focusing on science? And that's exactly what happened. Right after the Second World War, when there were so many things to think about, again, the focus was on creating agencies like National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. So the point I'm trying to make is, this is a very clear proof that when you have a crisis, a social crisis, a political crisis, and an economic crisis, successful governments and successful leaders always look to science and engineering as the future prospect. And history shows that, and we should not forget that history. The other remarkable thing about the evolution of this ecosystem, which is now being strained in all directions, is a very interesting mix of public-private industry partnerships. So we had universities like Harvard, which started in the early part of the 17th century, which now has the largest endowment of any university on the planet, with an endowment of about $36 billion, which as a private university, it runs that. Stanford is a little less than 20 billion. Yale University is a little higher than 20 billion. Princeton is about 10 to 15 billion or so. So you have models of private universities with very large endowments. Plus, the Vannevar Bush's thesis that it's the role of the government to support basic research. Plus, you have government labs that created an ecosystem of innovation. Plus, you have private labs like the Bell Labs, which produced so many Nobel laureates by creating technologies that benefited all of humankind, semiconductor technology, etc., communications technologies, and so forth. Plus, you had private philanthropy. So, given my new affiliation, I want to give the story of Carnegie Mellon. So, Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland to a relatively poor family. At age 13, he moved to the US, and his family ended up in Pittsburgh. And unlike many other immigrants of that time, he went into a technical field. So, he founded the US Steel Corporation, which at that time was the largest steel company in the world, based in Pittsburgh. He made a big fortune, personal fortune. And in 1900, he approached the city of Pittsburgh and he said, I will give $1 million of my money if you give land and you start a technical school. So the city of Pittsburgh gave funding and they started Carnegie Tech. Independently, another individual who became very wealthy in banking, Andrew Mellon, gave his fortune and created the Mellon Institute of Science. And in 1967, the then president of Carnegie Mellon, Guy Stever, he decided that it was a good idea to combine Carnegie Institute of Technology with Mellon Institute of Science, and he created Carnegie Mellon University in 1967. Remarkably, when Guy Stever stepped down as president of Carnegie Mellon, he became the director of the National Science Foundation. So there is, history repeats itself. So I want to mention this because private philanthropy has played a huge role in the evolution of the innovation ecosystem. And there is a very interesting, and that trend continues. So we have a College of Public Policy and Management called the Heinz College of Public Policy and Management, which is also headed by an IIT Madras graduate, Professor Krishnan Ramaya. And that college is the gift of the Heinz family from Pittsburgh. You may know Heinz Ketchup, and that family created that college. We have the Dietrich College of Humanities, which was just created with a $265 million bequest from the Dietrich family to support humanities at Carnegie Mellon University. So the combination of public funds and private philanthropy is very critical. It's a unique model that that American education system created during the course of the last century or more. The other interesting part of this, and I was asked this question quite a bit in many countries when I was director of NSF, it's not the money that you invest in science that makes a country an innovation leader, because a lot of people can do that, and a lot of people today have the money to do it. If money is the only way to reach the top of the innovation pyramid, many people would move there quickly. There has to be something else in there. So what are the ingredients of that something else? Again, if you go back to history, there are a lot of lessons to learn. You have to have an open, transparent process. And one can argue whether the system as it exists today in different countries is the right system or the perfect system. It may not be. But in principle, there are a lot of ingredients. For example, the scientific peer review process, where whether a proposal is worthy of funding is decided by scientists and not by politicians or government bureaucrats, was viewed to be a very critical step in furthering science. So agencies, and US cannot claim leadership here. Europe was also there decades ago or centuries before, but this was a very important part of the scientific innovation enterprise, that you not only put money into science, you also create a process where you announce the process in an open way when you have a call for proposal. When proposals come in, you review them using a transparent process, but you maintain confidentiality of the reviewers, and you protect the confidentiality of the authors and the proposers. And this system is very critical. And the key to this system is to keep politics out of scientific innovation and decisions. And that is viewed as one of the essential ingredients. And there are many countries that have created science funding agencies which are modeled after the National Science Foundation for that very reason. And I'll come to this a little bit more later. Then there is a balance between individual scholarship between big facilities. So take the example of Google. In the mid-1990s, there were two graduate students at Stanford, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. They received a fellowship from NSF to do a purely mathematical analysis for a PageRank method that would become a search engine called Google. If NSF had asked the question, what is the application of this? They would not have received the funding. They received a graduate research fellowship, no questions asked, purely on the basis of the merit of the individual. They did that work, and that became the nucleating idea, and they used venture capital funds in Silicon Valley to spin off Google. Now it's a $200 billion company, affecting most of the people on the planet in terms of their day-to-day lives. And this is the point I try to make. If we had asked the question, what is the return on investment, when we gave $50,000 to Sergey Brin or Larry Page, we would not have given the money because they had no good answer that would not have passed the peer review. And that's why oftentimes asking these kinds of questions may not be the right thing to do. Another example is GPS. GPS was funded by the Department of Defense during the Cold War in the 1960s, mainly for satellite monitoring and espionage purposes. But the National Science Foundation funded a lot of basic research in mathematics and computer science before there was formally a Department of Computer Science at most universities. And the goal was to do pure research to understand how global positioning system works, purely in terms of mathematics and engineering. And who would have thought in the 1960s that all of us will be walking around today with mobile devices that have GPS in them? Nobody knew. And that's what science does, because you have rewards 4 decades later, 5 decades later, that you never anticipate. And that's well beyond the funding cycle, well beyond the lifetime of most researchers and agency heads. And this is the reward of science. Individual scholarship. So Google is an example of two young people sitting in a university thinking of an idea. Same with Microsoft, same with Facebook, same with Apple. In some cases, they were college dropouts. They didn't finish their education. But that's what we mean by individual scholarship. Another example is the proof for the Fermat's last theorem done by Andrew Weil at Princeton. Andrew Weil was continuously funded by the National Science Foundation. Not because there was an application of Fermat's last theorem, but because it was the right thing to do. If there is a many hundred-year-old unsolved problem, you solve it. If there is any industry application or not. And that was done. And that's the individual scholarship. Plus, we also have big facilities. So the last decision that I had to make about funding was to sign an agreement to fund $400 million for a telescope in Chile for astronomy, for our astronomy division. And again, there is no practical application of this. We'll probably discover a new planet or a new galaxy or something like this, which may have some implication for somebody 100, 200 years down the road, but it's scientific curiosity. It may yield a lot of results. And this is on a foreign soil. So the telescope will be built in the country of Chile with American taxpayer money. So, but this is the right thing to do for science. And that's an example of a big facility. Another big facility is in Antarctica, which is $400 million a year. The continent of Antarctica doesn't belong to anybody. It's a free zone with 50 countries that have signed a membership in the Antarctic Treaty. And the National Science Foundation runs the US program, the entire US program for Antarctica. We do research in neutrino physics, climate change, penguin population, artists in residence, it's big data, etc., etc. And you do this because this is where you make the basic discoveries. And recently, about 3 months ago, there was a discovery of a new galaxy from the telescope that's located right on the South Pole in Antarctica. Again, these have no practical applications, but this furthers the human frontiers of knowledge, and this is the right thing to do. Fund the best people and the best ideas through this open and transparent system. Now, what are the dividends of this ecosystem of innovation? So since 1951, 201 Nobel laureates have had some portion of their Nobel Prize winning work linked to the National Science Foundation funding, which is 70% of all American Nobel laureates, who constitute approximately half of all the Nobel laureates. So it's a very large number. It's 35% of all the Nobel laureates in the world since 1950. It's only a $7 billion today. In 1950, it was $200,000 a year. Let's put that in perspective. Last year, Americans spent $7 billion on potato chips, $4 billion on Halloween candy just for one evening. So the investment in science is minuscule, but this is the outcome. And 201 Nobel Prizes have changed the world remarkably. So that's the return on investment that one asks for. Google is a return on investment. In economics, 47 Nobel laureates. So let me give an example. The word interdisciplinary research is very popular on all college campuses. So let me give an example of last year's Nobel Prize winners in economics. Two people won the Nobel Prize in economics last year. Lloyd Shapley and Al Roth. Both of them received continuous funding from the economics directorate at NSF for many years. They were funded to do purely mathematics research on optimization. So they could have done the optimization anyway. They could have had matchmaking for marriages, or so they did matchmaking for service providers with service recipients. And this was mathematics research. But the biggest application of that research was in biomedical field, where their algorithms are used today to match kidney patients who are waiting for kidney transplants with kidney donors. And that's one of the reasons why they were recognized for their work. And remarkably, they won the Nobel Prize in economics for an application in biomedical sciences. And this is the interdisciplinarity that you don't anticipate. For all the funding that was given to them, nobody knew that this will be the application. The last point I want to make is the economic impact of all of this, because ultimately this comes through. industrial, economic, and societal impact. So take a company like Qualcomm.